I went to the university cafe to clear my head, and instead my son's teacher found me there with concerns that would change how I see my role as a mother, and maybe even myself. What began as an ordinary afternoon turned into a quiet, unforgettable conversation I never expected. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Which city or state are you joining us from? And if stories like this speak to you, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. It truly helps keep these stories alive and reaching the people who enjoy them most. Thank you for being here with me. I still remember the smell of coffee that afternoon, the way it wrapped around me like a familiar coat. The university cafe had always been my place when I needed to think, not because I was a student there anymore, but because the hum of quiet conversations and the shuffle of books reminded me that life kept moving, learning, becoming. I had a mug warming my hands, my coat draped over the back of the chair, and a stack of notes I pretended to read. I was in my late 40s then, old enough to know that peace doesn't come easily, but young enough to still chase it when I could. My son had started high school that year, and I was adjusting to the strange mix of pride and worry that comes with watching a child step further away from you. That was partly why I was there, sitting alone, listening to the espresso machine hiss like it had something important to say. When I heard my name, I thought I imagined it. You don't expect to be recognized in places where your past and present don't usually meet. I looked up, and there he was, my son's teacher, standing there with a paper cup in his hand and a look of hesitation on his face, as though he wasn't sure whether he should interrupt my quiet moment. He greeted me politely, the way he always did at school meetings. Calm, respectful, measured. I invited him to sit, more out of courtesy than curiosity at first. But when he thanked me and took the chair across from me, I noticed something different. His shoulders were tense, his eyes thoughtful in a way that suggested this wasn't a chance encounter after all. The cafe around us faded slightly as he began to speak. He said he hoped he wasn't overstepping. That line alone told me this mattered to him. He explained that he recognized me and felt it might be better to talk face to face, away from crowded hallways and rushed conferences. His concern, he said gently, was about my son. As a mother, your heart always beats a little faster when someone says those words. I listened closely, nodding, trying to keep my expression steady. He spoke carefully, choosing words that showed both professionalism and genuine care. He wasn't criticizing. He wasn't alarming me. He was sharing observations, moments he'd noticed in class, changes so subtle they could easily be missed. The light from the tall windows fell across the table between us, catching the steam from our cups. Outside, students passed by laughing, unaware of the quiet weight of the conversation happening just a few feet away. I found myself appreciating the setting, how safe it felt, how grounded. It made it easier to listen without feeling defensive. As he talked, I realized this wasn't just about my son. It was about the shared responsibility adults have when guiding someone still finding his footing. There was a sincerity in his voice that surprised me. He wasn't there because it was required. He was there because he cared enough to reach out. I responded honestly, sharing my own observations from home. Late nights, shorter answers that thoughtful distance teenagers sometimes wear like armor. The conversation became a back and forth, not a lecture or a report, but a collaboration. For the first time in a while, I didn't feel alone in trying to understand my child. What struck me most was how human the moment felt. Two adults, neither pretending to have all the answers, meeting in the middle over coffee and concern. I noticed how carefully he listened when I spoke, how he didn't rush to fill the silence. It reminded me that respect can be quiet, and connection doesn't need grand gestures. By the time our cups were empty, something had shifted inside me. Not fear, not relief exactly, but awareness. Awareness that growth often begins with uncomfortable conversations, and that being open doesn't make you weak. As we stood to leave, he thanked me for my time, and I thanked him for his honesty. I watched him walk away, blending back into the flow of the university, and I stayed seated for a moment longer. The cafe sounded different then, richer somehow. I realized that afternoon wasn't just about my son's path forward. It was about mine too, and the quiet strength found in listening, trusting, and being willing to engage when life taps you on the shoulder in unexpected places. I didn't leave the cafe right away. I gathered my things slowly, as if moving too fast might scatter the thoughts that had settled around me. Outside, the afternoon had softened into that gentle light that makes everything look more forgiving. I walked across the campus without a clear destination, letting memory and concern walk beside me. That evening at home, I watched my son more closely than usual. Not in a way that hovered or pressed, but with a quieter attention. He moved through the kitchen, opening the refrigerator, closing it again, the way teenagers do when they're unsure what they're looking for. I asked about his day. He answered politely, briefly. Nothing alarming. Nothing comforting either. And yet, after the conversation at the cafe, I noticed the pauses between his words, the way his eyes drifted away when he spoke about school. Later, when the house was quiet, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and replayed the teacher's words. He had spoken about participation, about moments when my son seemed present but distant, capable but hesitant. I realized how easy it is to miss those signs when you're busy keeping everything else running. I felt a familiar tug of guilt, then reminded myself that noticing now still mattered. The next week passed with a new rhythm. I asked more open-ended questions. I listened more than I spoke. Some nights, my son surprised me with longer answers. Other nights, he retreated into his room, and I let him. Parenting, I was learning again, is often about knowing when to step closer and when to give space. Midweek, I received an email from the teacher. It wasn't formal, just a brief note checking in, sharing that my son had stayed after class to ask a question. It was a small thing, but it felt like progress. I appreciated the care behind the message, the quiet follow-through that matched the conversation we had. We agreed to meet again, this time at the school, after classes ended. I arrived early, sitting in one of the empty chairs lining the hallway. The walls were decorated with student projects, uneven but earnest, full of effort. It reminded me that learning is rarely neat, especially at that age. When he joined me, the setting felt different from the cafe, more structured, but the tone remained the same. Respectful, thoughtful. We talked about strategies, about encouragement without pressure. He shared insights from his experience, and I shared what I knew of my son's interests, his quiet strengths. There was no sense of blame, only shared intention. What surprised me was how these conversations changed me. I began to reflect on my own habits, my assumptions. I realized how often I rushed to solutions instead of understanding. The teacher wasn't just helping my son navigate school, he was reminding me of the power of patience. As weeks turned into months, subtle changes appeared at home. My son seemed lighter, more willing to engage. Not transformed, not suddenly confident, but steadier. I credited him first, then the support around him, and finally, myself for being open to a conversation that had started by chance. One afternoon, as I drove away from the school, I thought back to that university cafe. How close I had been to saying I was busy, to postponing the conversation. Life often offers these quiet crossroads, and we don't always recognize them until later. This time I had stopped, listened, and allowed myself to grow alongside my child. I didn't know then where this path would lead, only that it had already changed the way I paid attention to the world around me. And sometimes that's enough to begin. As autumn deepened, the days grew shorter, and with them came a new kind of quiet in our home. Not an empty quiet, but one filled with thought. I found myself noticing small details I might have ignored before. The sound of my son practicing a presentation aloud behind his closed door. The way he lingered at the dinner table a little longer, sometimes asking questions that drifted beyond homework and into ideas about the future. The teacher and I continued to exchange brief updates. Nothing excessive, nothing intrusive. Just a shared understanding that progress doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it shows up in steadier routines, in fewer sharp edges at the end of the day. I respected the balance we'd found, the way each of us stayed firmly in our roles while working toward the same goal. One afternoon, I was invited to attend a small school event showcasing student projects. I almost didn't go. Work had been long that week, and the couch was calling my name. But something told me to show up, to be present in a way I hadn't always managed before. So I went. The classroom buzzed with low conversation and nervous energy. Parents leaned in to listen. Students explained their work with varying degrees of confidence. When my son spotted me, there was a flicker of surprise on his face, followed by something warmer. He walked me through his project, explaining his choices, his challenges. I listened carefully, asking questions, letting him lead. I noticed the teacher standing off to the side, observing without hovering. When our eyes met, he gave a small nod, nothing more. In that moment, I felt a sense of shared understanding. This wasn't about recognition or credit. It was about support offered quietly, consistently. Driving home that evening, my son talked more than usual. About school, about ideas that interested him, about things he wasn't sure of yet. I let the conversation flow, resisting the urge to steer it. I realized how much trust is built when you allow someone to arrive at their own conclusions. Later that night, after the house had settled, I reflected on how much had changed since that day at the café. Not dramatically, not all at once, but meaningfully. I had learned to slow down, to listen without preparing my response. I had learned that concern, when shared with respect, can open doors instead of closing them. The teacher sent one more message that week, noting how my son had contributed thoughtfully during a group discussion. I smiled when I read it, not because it was praise, but because it reflected growth, the kind that comes from feeling seen, not pressured. I'd also noticed something else within myself, a renewed confidence in my ability to adapt. Parenting in your 40s and 50s comes with its own challenges. You're no longer figuring out who you are, but you are constantly adjusting how you show up for others. This experience reminded me that learning doesn't stop just because your children are growing up. There were moments of doubt, of course. Nights when I wondered if I was doing enough or too much. But those moments passed more quickly now. I trusted the process more. Trusted the people involved. Trusted my son's ability to find his way. As the season shifted toward winter, I felt a quiet gratitude for that unexpected meeting, for the courage it took on both sides to speak openly, for the reminder that meaningful change often begins with a simple conversation held in an ordinary place between people willing to listen. I didn't know exactly how the story would continue, but I knew this chapter had taught me something lasting. That growth is rarely loud. That respect creates space. And that sometimes the most important steps forward happen when you least expect them. By the time spring arrived, the world outside seemed to mirror what had been quietly unfolding inside our home. Trees along our street showed signs of green again, tentative at first, then more certain. I noticed how fitting that felt. Growth rarely announces itself all at once. It arrives gradually, almost shyly, until one day you realize things are no longer the same. My son had settled into a steadier rhythm. School was still school, with its pressures and routines, but it no longer felt like a looming shadow over our evenings. We shared more meals together without distraction. Sometimes we talked about practical things, sometimes about nothing in particular. And sometimes we simply sat in comfortable silence, which I had learned was its own kind of connection. The teacher and I crossed paths one final time before the school year ended. It was brief, standing near the front office as students hurried past, eager for summer. He thanked me for being engaged, for trusting the process. I thanked him in return, for caring enough to speak up when it mattered, and for doing so with kindness. There was no need to say more. The work had been done quietly, collaboratively. Driving home that day, I thought about how easily that first meeting could have been missed. How many moments in life pass us by because we're distracted or guarded? That afternoon at the university cafe had seemed ordinary at the time, yet it had set something meaningful in motion. It reminded me that listening is an act of courage, and that openness can lead to understanding instead of conflict. I also reflected on myself, on how this experience had shifted something deeper than my approach to parenting. It had reminded me that at this stage of life, growth doesn't mean reinvention. It means refinement, paying attention, being willing to learn from unexpected places and people. As summer approached, my son talked about plans, about interests he wanted to explore. I listened with a quiet confidence I hadn't always felt before. I didn't need to have all the answers. I just needed to stay present. Some stories don't end with dramatic moments or clear resolutions. They end with a sense of steadiness, of knowing you handled something the best way you could. This was one of those stories. A reminder that mutual respect can bridge gaps, that concern shared with care can strengthen rather than strain, and that even in the later chapters of life, there is always room to grow. When I think back on it now, I don't remember the exact words spoken that day at the cafe. I remember the feeling, the sense that I wasn't alone in wanting the best for my child, and that sometimes the most meaningful connections begin not with certainty, but with a simple willingness to listen.